It's been almost a year since government announced the sale of embattled airline South African Airways. Takatso Consortium has purchased a 51% share of the business. Now, the Minister of Public Enterprises confirming that government remains the airline's preferred shareholder and the first to receive dividends if the airline becomes profitable. Let's get more detail now about how exactly this deal is structured, and we speak now to the Acting Director General of Public Enterprises, that's Jacky Molisane, and she speaks to us alongside another Deputy Director General. In this instance, he is at Legal Assurance and Governance, that's Advocate Melanchton Makobe. To both of you, thank you very much for making the time to explain this intricate deal, if I could call it that. Let me start with you, Acting DG. How much is South African Airways being sold for?
In terms of South African Airways, I just need to indicate that when this deal was actually consummated, an independent valuation was actually being undertaken to actually evaluate the assets. And the valuation of the assets, it came to 3 billion rand. And this is taking into account the hangars, the slots, and all the assets that are actually pertaining to the airline. And what has actually happened is that with the strategic equity partner that is coming in, which is Takatso Consortium, the consortium has actually indicated on record that it will be providing 3 billion rands of working capital over 2 years. So it is important to actually underscore that that the assets are worth 3 billion, and the consortium will be providing working capital worth of 3 billion, and there will also be a preference shares that will actually be issued to that. So the total consideration that we're actually looking at is 3 billion and 51 rands.
Okay, and you mentioned that all-important figure just at the end of your response there, 51 rand. Is that the amount that SAA is being sold for to Takatso Consortium, this 51 rand?
No, 51 rands. It is the preference shares that they'll be actually getting for, that's what they'll be paying for. The amount that Takatso Consortium will be providing into this deal, it is 3 billion rand of working capital and 51 rand. So in essence, it's 3 billion and 51 rand. That is the consideration of the amount that Takatso as a consortium will be providing.
Advocate Makobe, I hope this is your realm now, the question I'm about to ask next. We've been told for some time that due diligence had been done in order to determine, in part, that Takatso Consortium actually has the money to see this deal through. Was due diligence done, and is Takatso Consortium's balance sheet healthy enough to purchase this airline?
Good morning, Collie, and good morning to the viewers of Newzroom Afrika. I'll get to that due diligence, but I just want to piggyback on what the acting DG has indicated to really clarify that the total purchase price that Takatso will be paying for SAA is 3 billion and 51 rand. And in addition to that, they are going to be putting in a further 3 billion as working capital into SAA. And given where the aviation industry is and how COVID has impacted it negatively, I think this is a good deal that has to be celebrated in South Africa. With regard to the due diligence, indeed, both parties have conducted due diligence on each other, and the department has also conducted a due diligence on Takatso, and we have, we are able to confirm that Takatso is able to make the necessary cash injection that they've committed to in terms of the sale and purchase agreement. So indeed, they've got the necessary financial ability, and their balance sheet will be able to carry this.
Are you able to tell us how much they are worth?
Well, look, that is for them to be able to determine. But as for us, our due diligence was to indicate, are they able to put the 3 billion working capital? Are they able to give us, once SAA makes profit, the 3 billion? And the answer was yes. So they are going to be able to raise the necessary capital. Their balance sheet is very strong, and they'll be able to go into the market and get the necessary capital for this.
Acting DG, let me ask the question, who is going to take responsibility for the 3.5 billion rand debt that we understand exists right now? Whose responsibility is that?
In terms of that responsibility, that is called historical debt that the entity SAA was actually faced with. Government actually has to take care of that historic liability. I just need to indicate to you, Xoli, to say when SAA went into business rescue, the quantum of the money that was required by Takatso to be able to implement the business rescue, a total amount, it was 14 billion rands. And of that 14 billion rand, 10.5 billion was already made available by government as an undertaking that in order to implement the business rescue plan. And now the balance of the 3.5 is still required by government to be able to implement the business rescue plan. So government is actually obliged by law to actually make that money available to complete the implementation of the business rescue plan.
Now, that's a very interesting answer, because in my next question, which will come after the break, is if SAA again gets itself into debt, who is going to pick up the tab? Is government still going to be responsible? That's the next question when we return from the break. Please stay watching. I'm going to continue this conversation in a moment. You're watching Newsfeed AM. We are discussing the 3 billion rand deal that Takatso Consortium, we understand, is purchasing South African Airways for. And for this conversation, we are joined by the acting DG at Public Enterprises, Jacky, Molisane, and the Deputy Director General at Legal Assurance and Governance, same department, that's Advocate Melanchton Makobe. Let's come to you, Advocate. So you've heard the DG saying that government remains responsible for the 3.5 billion rand debt that SAA still has. And so I suppose this is what has been the stumbling block, the clearing of this debt before Takatso officially takes over. But what happens if SAA gets itself into yet another debt? Who is going to be responsible? Are we going to see government basically stepping in and giving SAA another bailout?
Let me explain it like this, Toli. I think when SAA faced financial difficulties, we had two options. One, to restructure SAA and get into the business rescue process, which is the route that we chose. But two, to tip it into liquidation. And the liquidation was not a preferred option, because it would have meant that the employees will get 32,000 only in terms of the Insolvency Act. It would have meant the demise of SAA. It would have meant the demise of the national carrier. It would have meant the demise of the local. And we said the best option is to restructure SAA through a business rescue process. And through that process, government had committed an amount of 14 billion to implement the business rescue process. Because for any business rescue, the shareholder must put a particular amount to make sure that the business rescue process is successful. So an amount of 10.5 billion was made available by government as part of implementation of the business rescue process. The balance that is outstanding to pay the creditors and the unflown ticket liability is 3.5 billion. So whether or not there was a Takatso deal, the 3.5 million is what government has committed in terms of the business rescue process of SAA to finalize its implementation. So whether there was a strategic equity partner in Takatso or not, government would have been responsible for that. So those are the historical liabilities.
Yeah.
And government said, going forward, the fiscus is very much constrained and will not be able to inject further capital into SAA. So we need a strategic equity partner that can come in and put the necessary capital into SAA. That is where Takatso comes in, to make sure that going forward, government will not be putting any cent in terms of the working capital of SAA. And that is why Takatso has committed over the next 2 years to inject 3 billion into SAA. So government will not be injecting any further funding into SAA. And that is really the core reason why we have a strategic equity partner.
All right, that's a very interesting response, because as a 49% shareholder, this is government now, does that mean that government will no longer have to put in what is called government guarantees for SAA should it get into trouble financially? Are you saying that that is going to be a thing of the past? If that happens, Takatso steps in financially.
Exactly. The only funding that we are responsible for is the historical liabilities, which is the 3.5 billion, the historical guarantees. Remember, SAA historically had borrowed money from the banks on the bank of the government guarantees. So those will be responsible for. But going forward, the government will not be responsible in terms of guarantee or further capital into SAA. Takatso Consortium will do that going forward.
Acting DG Molisane, are you able to say with certainty that this private equity partner, that's Takatso Consortium, it has money, as Advocate Makobe earlier stated, that their balance sheet is healthy, but can you tell us, without any doubt, that no government money has been used by this company in order to purchase this airline?
In response to that, a due diligence was actually undertaken on Takatso Consortium. Takatso Consortium does have the money, and they themselves are on record have indicating that they will be able to provide the necessary funding on this particular transaction. So I can indicate without any fear of contradiction to indicate that Takatso, in terms of the due diligence that we've actually done, it is one entity that has proven itself to have operations and have a very strong balance sheet, and they will be able to provide the 3 billion that is actually required. And there will not be any money that will be forthcoming from government once this deal has been finalized. Once all the regulatory approvals have been secured, there will be no money coming from government.
All right. I'm really wrapping up right now. I need for this to be crystal clear, Acting DG. The fact that Takatso Consortium is part owned by a company called Harith General Partners, which itself is owned in part by the PIC. The PIC confirmed last year that it owns 30% of Harith. Are you saying to us that none of that matters because the money that Takatso is committing to SAA, none of it is money from the PIC?
The money that is coming from Takatso, it's the money that is on the strength of its balance sheet of 3 billion. That is what we've actually ascertained from the due diligence that we've actually done. And that is part of the criteria that we've actually used into selecting a strategic equity partner, taking into account the strategic fit, the funding capacity, and the operational experience that the entity has, and looking at the national interest and executability of this transaction. So that I need to underscore to the audiences out there on Takatso. They've actually met those criteria that we've actually set out as government.
All right. And when can we see the deal finally being concluded? Is there a timeline?
The deal will be finalized once the regulatory approval has been secured. It has to go through the Competition Commission, and that is when all the CPs would be finalized. Then the deal effectively would have been concluded.
All right. I hope that is as clear to you, the viewer, as it has been to myself. I hope I've asked all the questions that have been niggling in your mind. Thank you to both these officials. That's the Acting Director General, Jacky Molisane, and another Deputy Director General, in this instance, at Legal Assurance and Governance, still within Public Enterprises. That's Advocate Melanchton Makobe. Thank you both for your time.